You are about to witness the collapse of a giant. Wait to see how the man who promised to die for Christ became his greatest traitor under the light of a cold campfire. Stay to watch the autopsy of Peter's ego and discover why God allows your world to crumble so that something eternal can be built. Don't miss the moment when shame meets absolute forgiveness. This is the Bible teaches. For 3 years, the rhythm of Peter's steps was dictated by an unshakable certainty, a pattern of proximity where the Master's shadow served as his shield against any external doubt or threat. He slept with the comfort of one who felt like the right hand of the kingdom, the first among the 12, the man whose rock seemed made of granite, immune to the wear and tear of time or fear. But the silent normalcy of that Last Supper was about to be shattered by a phrase Peter could not comprehend with an intellect limited by pride. The man who saw himself as the pillar of a spiritual revolution was about to wake up in a nightmare where his only weapon, his self-confidence, would be turned against his own chest. You observe the cold sweat breaking on the back of Peter's neck as he walks through the Garden of Gethsemane, the smell of damp earth and ancient olive trees weighing in the air like an omen of imminent death. The lighting is scarce. Only the pale glow of the moon filtered through the tree canopies, projecting twisted shadows that seem to whisper the names of his deepest fears. The thesis of this autopsy begins here. Jesus wasn't just predicting a fall. He was authorizing a controlled demolition of Simon's ego so that the spiritual Peter could be born from the ashes. The gritty realism reveals the almost imperceptible tremor in Peter's hands as he grips the hilt of his sword, a desperate attempt to maintain control over a destiny already slipping through his fingers. The Christian psychology of this moment shows that the isolation of the soul begins when we stop listening to the warning and start trusting our own perception of reality. Peter didn't know it yet, but Jesus' silence in that garden was not a lack of power, but the preparation for the greatest test of emotional endurance a human being could bear. Something deep began to crumble at the foundation of his identity. And the question that would haunt him through the high priest's courtyard was already being written in the unseen realm. The mystery isn't whether he would fall, but how he would survive the weight of his own shame when the rooster crowed for the first time. You follow Peter's erratic movement as he tries to maintain a safe distance, yet close enough to see what they are doing to the Master. The realism here is cold and biting. The early morning air in Jerusalem carries the scent of damp wood smoke and the metallic odor of the temple guard's armor. The uneven stone floor of Caiaphas' courtyard hurts the soles of your feet, and you notice Peter's tunic is stained with Gethsemane's dew, symbolizing the trail of a battle he thought would be physical, but has become purely psychological. His Christian psychology reveals that Peter is living through the night of the senses, where all his references of strength, his sword, his physical vigor, his powerful voice, become useless before a system that does not want his blood, but his moral surrender. The thesis of this autopsy advances to the moment where loyalty is tested in the vacuum of utility. Peter does not know how to be a follower of someone who allows himself to be arrested without a fight. The torchlight in the courtyard creates shadows that seem to judge his every move, revealing the cold sweat soaking his tangled hair as he approaches the fire to seek the warmth his soul has already lost. The macro and micro connection is agonizing. While the Sanhedrin decides Israel's geopolitical and spiritual fate in luxurious rooms, the micro focuses on the trembling hands of a fisherman about to discover that the heaviest metal he ever carried wasn't a sword, but the weight of his own fear of being identified. The atmosphere is saturated by a silent tension where the crackling of the embers acts as a timer for the imminent collapse of his integrity. The practical and spiritual application for the modern viewer is a high-definition mirror. We are Peter whenever we try to maintain proximity to the sacred without accepting the risk of the suffering that such proximity demands. Something deep began to crumble in the confidence he had in his own emotional biology, and the silence of the night hides the first crack in his granite ego. The mystery now hanging over the coals is not whether Peter will deny, but what will remain of a man who sees his hero image disintegrate before a question asked by a servant girl. You watch the glow of the flames reflected in Peter's dilated pupils, a fire that warms the skin but cannot reach the cold that is settled in his bones. The realism here is claustrophobic. Caiaphas's courtyard is a sea of sweaty faces and hostile voices, blending with the smell of smoke and old leather. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals that Peter's first denial was not an act of malice, but a survival reflex of an ego that had not yet been crucified. He lies to protect the version of himself that still believes in a future without the cross. The central thesis is that public humiliation is God's surgical tool for removing the cancer of self-sufficiency. You feel the rough texture of the wall where Peter leans, ain't seeking to vanish into the shadows, as a servant girl's voice cuts the air like a razor, exposing the fragility of his rock of lies. The atmosphere is one of silent betrayal, cracking the earth beneath the disciples' feet, validating the pain of one who realizes his courage was just a construction of empty words. This macro and micro connection shows how the fate of the early church's leadership is being ground down in the microscopic detail of a trembling lip and a fleeting glance. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of the dust Peter nervously kicks as he moves away from the fire, an economical movement that reveals the internal collapse of his dignity. The practical application for the viewer is a confrontation with the Peter that lives within us, the one who loves the Messiah's glory, but fears the dust of the path leading to judgment. The retention tension reaches a breaking point as the second and third questions arise, each more aggressive than the last, turning the courtyard into a courtroom where Peter is the defendant of his own conscience. Something deep began to crumble in the mask of perfection he sustained for 3 years, and the pattern of heroic faithfulness was replaced by the animal instinct of flight. The mystery now dominating the scene is not whether he will flee, but if he will withstand the impact of Jesus' gaze crossing the courtyard at the exact moment of the final fall. You smell the fear and taste the bitter promise broken, floating in the cold Jerusalem air. You witness the instant the sound cuts through the dawn like a bronze blade, the shrill crowing of a rooster echoing between the stone walls of the courtyard, acting like a judge's gavel closing the trial of an ego. The realism here is desolate. The gray light of dawn begins to reveal Peter's face, no longer the face of a warrior, but of a man whose features have collapsed under the weight of his own cowardice. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals that the rooster's crow was not a sound of condemnation, but the alarm clock of grace, forcing Peter to confront the false self he tried to protect with oaths and curses. The central thesis is that truth only hurts as long as the lie still breathes. The moment Peter realizes he failed exactly as Jesus predicted, the foundation of his self-sufficiency turns into quicksand. The gritty realism focuses on the microscopic detail, the slow movement of Jesus' neck as he is led by the guards, and the inevitable crossing of gazes across the courtyard. There is no hatred in the Master's eyes, but a deep, omniscient sadness that strikes the center of Peter's soul, turning the cold sweat on his forehead into tears that burn like acid. This micro and macro connection shows the collapse of a leader at the very moment the fate of human redemption is being sealed on a cross. The atmosphere is one of silent agony, where the smell of ashes and the damp Jerusalem air validate the pain of a man who discovered his greatest enemy wasn't Rome, but the reflection he saw in the mirror. The practical application for the viewer is a necessary therapeutic pause. Often, we need the rooster to crow in our lives, so we stop running from who we truly are before God. The retention tension remains in the deafening silence following the gaze. Something deep has crumbled irretrievably, and Peter now runs into the darkness, not to hide, but because his inner world has imploded. The mystery that remains is whether such a shattered heart can be mended, or if the agony of denial will be the last word on his life. If this silence and this gaze from Jesus are finding a place in you, if you realize that your failure is not the end but the beginning of your true identity, I invite you to leave your sign of support in this journey of healing. Join us so that biblical truth continues to illuminate the basements of our souls. Right here in the comments, as a seal of commitment, my healing has begun. You watch Peter running out of the courtyard, his feet stumbling over the uneven stones of Jerusalem's alleys, as the darkness of dawn tries to hide a man who can no longer run from himself. The realism here is visceral. The sound of his breath is an asthmatic hiss, broken by sobs that tear through his chest, while sweat and tears mix with the dust clinging to his tangled beard. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals that this isn't just a cry of sadness, but the sound of the false self dying. Peter is mourning the image of the invincible hero he built, which now lies dead in Caiaphas's courtyard. The central thesis is that bitter weeping is the water that cleanses the soul's eyes, so it can see God without the mist of pride. You feel the cold of the stone against which he finally collapses, the smell of mold and earth from the narrow streets validating the pain of a destiny that seems reduced to ashes before the sun even rises. The atmosphere is one of absolute isolation, where God's silence seems to echo Peter's own denial, creating a retention tension that crushes any attempt at self-justification. This macro and micro connection reveals that while the plan of salvation moves toward Calvary to redeem humanity, the micro focuses on the collapse of a man who feels unworthy to be part of that story. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's nails digging into the earth, dirty and broken, symbolizing the futile effort of one who tried to hold the kingdom with his own hands. The practical application for the viewer is a mirror of healing. Peter's agony teaches us that hit bottom is the only place where the rock of our character can be truly tested and rebuilt by the Creator. Something deep began to crumble in the structure of Simon's pride, and the self-sufficient leader pattern was replaced by a vulnerability that physically hurts in every fiber of his body. The mystery now inhabiting the darkness is no longer Jesus' trial, but Peter's silence, a silence loaded with a repentance that does not yet know resurrection. Tension remains in the damp morning air. How can the man who denied life continue to breathe in a world he himself helped condemn with his fear? You enter the next day, the Saturday of absolute silence, where time seems to have clotted like the blood on Peter's garments. The realism here is of an oppressive static. The Jerusalem sun shines outside, but inside the hiding place, the light is an enemy, revealing the swollen face and rumpled clothes of a man who lost the right to call himself a disciple. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the phenomenon of the identity vacuum. When Peter denied Jesus, he didn't just betray the master, he murdered the only version of himself that made sense. Without Jesus to call him Cephas, he goes back to being just Simon, a failed fisherman in a sea of guilt with no shores. The central thesis is that God's silence on Saturday is the womb where true humility is gestated, far from the crowd's eyes. You smell the mold and stale bread in the enclosed room, validating the weight of every hour passing without the voice of the one who used to give meaning to chaos. The atmosphere is saturated by a retention tension coming not from an external threat, but from the devastating internal dialogue repeating the rooster's crow in an infinite loop in Peter's mind. This macro and micro connection shows that while the Roman Empire and the religious system celebrate the peace of the grave, the micro focuses on the agony of a man who would give anything to go back in time and just be an anonymous face in the courtyard. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's hands, which now tremble not from fear, but from a spiritual exhaustion that prevents him even from praying. His nails are dirty with garden soil, a physical trace of the place where he slept when he should have watched. The practical application for the viewer is the confrontation with our own Saturdays of silence, when our mistakes seem so large that forgiveness sounds like a geometric impossibility. Something deep began to crumble in Peter's hope, and the implicit question hanging in the heavy air is whether resurrection can reach someone who feels like a corpse inside. The star pupil pattern was replaced by the naked reality of a sinner without disguises, which is, ironically, the first step toward real holiness. The mystery now isn't what will happen to Jesus' body, but if Peter's soul will survive the absence of a final word from the Master. Tension remains. The man who wanted to build tabernacles on the Mount of Transfiguration now cannot even sustain the weight of his own head. The first ray of Sunday sun cuts through the crack in the heavy wooden door, but it brings no relief, only the cruel revelation that the world keeps turning while Peter's heart remains stagnant in Caiaphas's courtyard. The realism here is frantic and dusty. The sound of desperate knocking at the door and Mary Magdalene's trembling voice bring news that Peter's intellect rejects, but his wounded soul begs to be true. This Autopsy's Christian psychology focuses on the unworthiness defense mechanism. Peter doesn't feel he has the right to hear about miracles, as he has become the personification of human failure. The central thesis is that grace doesn't wait for you to heal to manifest. It invades your morning and forces you to run, even with lungs burning and legs heavy with guilt. You feel the texture of Peter's rough tunic brushing against your legs as he begins to run through the narrow, deserted streets of Jerusalem, the smell of dew and wet earth mixing with the scent of his own sweat of exhaustion. The gritty realism reveals the microscopic detail, the impact of Peter's bare feet against the cold ground, nails still dirty with earth, and the tremor of his breath unable to keep up with the speed of his desperation. This macro and micro connection shows one of the pillars of faith being forged in the heat of a race against his own shame, while the church's fate depends on a man who can only think of his last mistake. The atmosphere is one of electric uncertainty, where the retention tension lies in the question, what does a traitor expect to find in an empty tomb? The practical application for the viewer is the mirror of our own spiritual haste. Often we run to God not out of pure faith, but out of a sacred panic that our story ended in yesterday's error. Something deep began to crumble in the paralysis of his remorse, and the depressive isolation pattern was broken by the raw movement toward the light. The mystery now waiting at the mouth of the cave is not just the absence of a body, but the presence of a forgiveness Peter doesn't yet know how to name. You enter the cold shadows of the rock-cut tomb, where the residual smell of myrrh and aloes mixes with the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. The realism here is tactile and unsettling. Peter does not find a glorious body, but the absolute void of a stone bench and linen cloths folded with a calm that defies his internal chaos. This Autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the shock of the sacred vacuum. For a man who expected to find death to validate his guilt, the empty tomb is an enigma depriving him even of the consolation of mourning. The central thesis is that God often removes all visible evidence of his presence to force the soul to abandon seeing is believing and embrace trusting is being. You watch Peter touch the cold, rough texture where the master lay, his hands still marked by the tremor of denial, symbolizing the fragility of a man seeking a physical answer to a crisis that is entirely spiritual. The atmosphere is one of paralyzing expectation, where the tomb's silence acts as an amplifier for the pounding heart of a traitor who now feels like an intruder in his own hope. In this macro and micro connection shows the exact moment human redemption story becomes an experience of radical solitude for Peter. While the cosmos celebrates victory over death, the micro focuses on the sweaty pores of a man's forehead, wondering if resurrection includes those who swore they did not know the resurrected. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of the sunlight entering through the stone opening, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air, revealing Peter's face marked by a confusion bordering on despair. The practical application for the viewer is the confrontation with our own empty tombs, the moments when God removes what we know so we can finally know him as he is. Something deep began to crumble in his logic of punishment. And the retention tension lies in the fact that Jesus' silence after the tomb is louder than any accusation. The convicted guilty pattern is being challenged by a folded cloth, and Peter doesn't know it yet. But his restoration began the very instant he realized he had nothing left to offer but his own void. The mystery now inhabiting the tomb's exit isn't who took the body, but who will seek the man who fled. Tension remains. Peter leaves the cave as a man who saw the end of death, but who still carries the stench of his own denial ingrained in his soul. You observe Peter walking along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where the smell of dried fish and sun-rotted seaweed is more familiar and safer than the holiness he believes he has lost forever. The realism here is of a resigned decay. The sound of waves hitting the old wooden boat's hull is a rhythmic reminder of his own inconsistency. This Autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the phenomenon of trauma regression. Peter doesn't go back to the boat just to fish. He goes back because the boat is the only place he doesn't have to be the apostle, the place where he can hide in his old identity as Simon, the low-value fisherman. The central thesis is that the wounded ego seeks the comfort of the past to avoid the agony of a future where it feels unworthy. You feel the roughness of the hemp nets in his hands, marked by old scars and new blisters of fatigue, symbolizing a man trying to mend life with the same threads that left him empty 3 years ago. The atmosphere is one of gray melancholy, where the morning mist over the water acts as a curtain isolating Peter from his mission, creating a retention tension based on the fear that he will never leave this cycle. This macro and micro connection shows how a leadership collapse can lead to the abandonment of a global purpose because of unresolved private pain. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of cold, dark water splashing on his face, washing away sweat, but not the shame that seems to have become part of his very skin. The practical application for the viewer is a warning about the temptation to go back to the boat whenever we fail God. The past is a refuge that becomes a prison if you use it to run from the voice still calling you in the morning. Something deep began to crumble in his will to continue. And the abandonment of ministry pattern seems to be his only logical way out. Tension remains in the vessel's sway. Peter casts the net, but it is not fish he seeks. He is trying to fish for his lost dignity in a sea that has nothing to offer but silence and empty nets. The mystery now hanging over the beach isn't the lack of fish, but the solitary figure beginning to prepare a fire on the sand, waiting for the man who hasn't yet had the courage to look toward dry land. You feel the monotonous sway of the boat under a sky starting to pale, transitioning from deep blue to a frozen gray, announcing the end of a useless night. The realism here is of a physical frustration, the sound of water hitting the hull, the creaking of old wood, and the smell of cold sweat mixed with the swampy odor rising from the depths. Peter casts the net with a force trying to compensate for his soul's weakness, but with every pull, what comes up is only the weight of soaked ropes and the void reflecting his own chest. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals that fruitless labor is the final stage of exile of the self. When you run from your purpose to hide in the past, even the waters that once fed you seem to conspire to prove you no longer belong on that shore. The central thesis is that the sterility of human effort is God's final invitation to spiritual dependence. You observe the pores of Peter's skin dilated by the early morning cold, trembling hands no longer possessing their former precision, symbolizing a man losing the battle against time and against his own relevance. Suddenly, the smell of roasted fish and the crackling of real embers begin to float over the water, cutting through the morning mist like a specter of a traumatic memory. This macro and micro connection is unsettling. Peter recognizes the aroma. It is the smell of the fire from Caiaphas' courtyard, the scent of the place where he denied life, now reenacted by God on a deserted beach to force him into one last confrontation. The atmosphere is saturated by a retention tension paralyzing the oars. This is the anatomy of a reunion. Peter tried to postpone his whole life. The moment when truth does not pursue you with a sword, but waits for you with a meal. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of the fire's smoke rising in a straight line against the dawn light, while a solitary figure on the sand shouts the question that dismantles any technical defense. "Children, have you anything to eat?" Something deep crumbled in Simon's illusion of self-sufficiency, and the practical application for the viewer is a reality check. God knows your hiding place, and He is setting the stage to burn your past in the fire of His presence. You witness the instant John's voice whispers the impossible, "It is the Lord." And the effect on Peter is an immediate combustion of fear and desire. The realism here is of aquatic desperation. Peter doesn't wait for the boat to dock. He puts on his tunic, tying it with an urgency that seems like an attempt to cover his physical shame before meeting holiness, and plunges into the sea. In the cold of the Galilee water against sweaty skin is a thermal shock symbolizing the baptism of a traitor who prefers the risk of drowning in Christ's presence to staying safe in His absence. Christian psychology reveals that Peter's dive is the act of faith of the bankrupt. He has nothing to offer, no full net, only his own body being dragged by the current toward the only one who knows who he truly is. The thesis of this autopsy focuses on the violence of grace, pulling us from comfort zones to put us face to face with our greatest wound. You observe Peter's heavy and clumsy movement swimming toward the shore, the smell of salt and fresh water mixing with the panic of his own breath. The gritty realism describes the microscopic detail. Peter's legs finding the sandy bottom and stones, the exhausted stumble as he exits the water, ease in the sight of the fire's embers illuminating the master's face. This macro and micro connection shows that the church's fate is being decided in the silence of a breakfast on the sand, between the dripping water from a sinner's clothes and the calm gaze of a resurrected God. The atmosphere is one of solemn and overwhelming welcome, where the practical application for the viewer is the understanding that your greatest fall does not make you a stranger to God, but a guest at the table of restoration. The retention tension reaches a climax as Peter stops before Jesus, soaked, breathless, and humbled, while the smell of roasted fish evokes the memory of the courtyard. Something deep crumbled in the distance guilt created, and the mystery now dominating the beach is what will be said when the fire's silence is broken. The viewer realizes Peter is not being called to a trial, but to an autopsy of love, where every denial will be replaced by a new layer of purpose. Peter's dive was the sound of a soul that gave up on itself to finally find itself in God. If you feel that you are also swimming against the current of your own guilt, do not stop now. The journey of restoration is just beginning. Click the like button if you believe that no abyss is too deep for Jesus' hand to reach you. You sit on the sand, hearing only the rhythmic sound of the waves and the loud crackling of the wood consuming the embers. The realism here is of surgical intimacy. Jesus looks at Peter, not at his fisherman's arms, but at the invisible scars of his soul. Christian psychology reveals that the question, "Do you love me more than these?" is not a performance check, but a tool to remove Peter's comparative ego. He, who always wanted to be the greatest, is now confronted with his own inability to love through his own effort. The central thesis is that God shatters our pride to rebuild our character on the foundation of admitted fragility. You observe the detail of the ash flying from the fire and landing on Jesus' bare foot, symbolizing the union between the divine and human dust in a moment of total healing. The atmosphere is one of redemptive agony, where every "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you" is a sob trying to heal the wound opened by the three denials. This macro and micro connection reveals that a global leader's restoration must pass through the microscopic detail of his emotional honesty. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's eyelids, heavy and damp, and his voice failing as he admits his love is not agape, but only a fragile friendship, phileo. The practical application for the viewer is the relief of knowing Jesus doesn't work with our projection of perfection, but with our naked truth. He accepts the little we have to transform it into the much the kingdom needs. The retention tension remains in the repetition of the questions, a process making Peter grieved, a sorrow not of death, but of birth. Something deep crumbled in the myth that Peter was the rock by his own strength, and the self-generated leader pattern was replaced by the grace-sustained leader. The video's mystery reaches its point of revelation. The church would not be built on Peter's ego, but on the rubble of that ego, where the only thing left was the love of Christ. The viewer feels the weight of the responsibility now returned to hands that have learned to tremble. Feed my sheep. You observe Peter standing on the damp sand as the morning sun begins to dry the salt on his skin, leaving a white trail symbolizing the end of an era of self-sufficiency. The realism here is of a structural transformation, The man who threw himself into the sea in despair now breathes with a calm coming not from his temperament, but from the security of being known and yet accepted. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the birth of the true self. Peter finally understands that the name Rock, Cephas, given by Jesus, was not a description of his muscular or emotional strength, but a prophecy of what God would do with his pieces. The central thesis is that spiritual authority is not given to the invincible, but to those broken and rebuilt by mercy. You feel the sand's texture under Peter's feet, now firm, as the sea breeze clears the last trace of smoke from Caiaphas's fire that seemed ingrained in his soul. The atmosphere is one of restorative solemnity, where the sound of waves acts like heaven's applause for a man who had the courage to admit his bankruptcy. This macro and micro connection shows how the early church's foundation was being cemented in the microscopic detail of a cry that stopped and a mission that began. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's gaze, no longer fleeing Jesus's look. His eyes are red from exhaustion and tears, but they shine with a clarity he never possessed in the days of his arrogance. Not the practical application for the viewer is the end of imposter syndrome. If Jesus didn't give up on Peter after a public betrayal, he won't give up on you after your secret failures. Something deep crumbled in his need to prove worth, and the retention tension now lies in the grandeur of what is to come. The fisherman of fish pattern was definitively replaced by the shepherd of souls. And the mystery now surrounding the beach is how this man, who trembled before a servant girl, will face empires and Sanhedrins. You realize Peter's strength is now borrowed. He is no longer the owner of his courage, but the administrator of a grace he knows he doesn't deserve. The question hanging in the air, as clear as the Galilee horizon, is how far a man can go when his ego has been killed and his soul has been resurrected by love. You feel the beach temperature rise as Jesus walks alongside Peter, but the tone of the conversation shifts to a frequency of sacrifice that makes Peter's blood run cold for an instant. Realism here is prophetic and raw. Jesus describes a future where Peter's hands, now holding nets and bread, will be stretched out and bound by others. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the price of restoration. Being forgiven doesn't mean being spared, but being empowered to suffer for what you once feared. The central thesis is that true spiritual maturity is reached when the fear of death is swallowed by love for the Master. You observe the detail of Peter's shadow projected on the sand, which for a brief moment seems to take the shape of a cross, a visual omen of the fate awaiting the one who decided to feed the sheep until the end. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's breath becoming heavy upon hearing about his own martyrdom. There is no more bluster as before, only a reverent silence as he processes the cost of his new freedom. This macro and micro connection shows that church leadership would not be a throne of glory, but a journey toward total self-giving. The atmosphere is of absolute surrender, where the practical application for the viewer is the confrontation with our own following. Are we willing to love Christ when the prize is not comfort, but sacrifice? Retention tension peaks when Peter looks aside, seeing John, and tries again to compare himself, only to be silenced by the final phrase, "What is that to you? You follow me." Something deep crumbled in his curiosity about the fate of others, forcing him to focus on his own cross. Now the spiritual competitiveness pattern was crushed by an individual and non-transferable call. The mystery now isn't what will happen to the other apostles, but how Peter will walk under the shadow of this prophecy. The viewer feels that Peter's ego received the coup de grace. He no longer wants to be the greatest. He just wants to be faithful. The smoke from the beach fire dissipates, but the fire in Peter's heart has just been lit, and nothing in Rome or Jerusalem can extinguish it. You are transported from the calm Galilee environment to the suffocating heat and deafening noise of Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost. Realism here is electric and sensory. The smell of crowds, incense, and dust mixed with a rushing wind that seems to carry the weight of eternity. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the identity explosion. The Peter emerging from the upper room is not a better version of the fisherman, but a new creature inhabited by God's own breath. The central thesis is that the Holy Spirit does not dwell in inflated egos, but in vessels broken in the courtyard of denial and glued on the beach of restoration. You observe the detail of the tongues of fire, an illumination that doesn't burn hair, but ignites the word, turning the tongue that once denied into a trumpet announcing the kingdom. The atmosphere is of overwhelming authority, where the retention tension lies in the absolute contrast between the Peter who fled the servant girl and the Peter now facing thousands of accusers. This macro and micro connection shows the church's official birth through the final collapse of private shame. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of the sweat running down Peter's face as he speaks. Sweat now shining with the anointing of one who has nothing left to lose because he already lost everything. The practical application for the viewer is the promise that your greatest trauma can become your greatest pulpit if you allow suffering to mature your faith. Something deep crumbled in the crowd's resistance upon hearing the voice of a man speaking with the authority of one who has been to the hell of guilt and returned by God's hand. The fear of persecution pattern was replaced by the boldness of the Spirit. The mystery now dominating Jerusalem isn't the phenomenon of tongues, but the radical transformation of a character. The viewer realizes that the true construction of the church didn't start with bricks, but with the shattered ego of a man now rising to say, "This is what was spoken by the prophet." The rooster no longer crows to accuse. Now the Spirit shouts to set free. You walk through the cold, echoing corridors of the Sanhedrin, where the smell of expensive incense and ancient scrolls tries to disguise the odor of a religiosity rotted by power. The realism here is of institutional tension. The faces of Annas and Caiaphas are submerged in the shadow of their luxurious robes, while the daylight entering through high windows illuminates only the dust dancing between Peter and his accusers. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the phenomenon of fear substitution. Peter now faces the same men who made him tremble months ago, but there is no more flight instinct, only cutting clarity. Even the central thesis is that the dead ego cannot be intimidated, for there is nothing left to protect but the truth. You observe the detail of Peter's hand, firm on the staff or his tunic, without the tremor that denounced him in the courtyard, symbolizing a man whose center of gravity shifted from human opinion to divine approval. The atmosphere is of a silent spiritual duel, where Peter's authority comes not from a title, but from the scar of his own restoration. This macro and micro connection shows how the fate of a persecuted faith is being forged in the microscopic detail of a fisherman looking a high priest in the eye and refusing to lower his tone. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's voice. It is no longer shrill with panic, but deep, hoarse from constant use. I waited with the gravity of one who saw the Messiah breathe after death. The practical application for the viewer is the diagnosis of true courage. It is not born from the absence of fear, but from the total loss of the need to be accepted by those who hate your master. Something deep crumbled in the Sanhedrin's control structure upon hearing that it's better to obey God than men. The convenience religion pattern was shattered by the reality of a conviction fearing neither prison nor scourge. Retention tension remains in the courtroom's heavy air. Israel's leaders realize they are before an unlearned and ignorant man, but one carrying the scent of Jesus. The mystery now haunting Jerusalem's corridors is how to stop a man who has already died to himself. You feel that Peter is now the rock Jesus promised, not because of granite strength, but because of total transparency before the Spirit. You observe the hustle in Jerusalem's narrow streets, where the smell of disease, open sewers, and human despair dominates the environment. Realism here is tactile and raw. The sick are brought on rotten straw mats, with open sores and eyes consumed by fever, placed strategically so Peter's shadow, in passing, might touch their bodies. Christian psychology reveals the influence paradox. Peter doesn't seek the spotlight, he just walks, but his presence has become so saturated with God that even his physical trail carries virtue. This autopsy's central thesis is that a man's greatest anointing flows not from his effort, but from his shadow, what he produces without noticing while focused on Christ. You feel the midday sun's heat and hear the sound of moans being replaced by shouts of joy, validating the pain of a ministry now measured by others' healing rather than self-protection. This macro and micro connection reveals that the early church's expansion depended on a man's willingness to get his hands dirty in the mire of human misery. The gritty realism focuses on the detail of Peter's skin texture, sun-scorched and calloused, contrasting with the smoothness of the grace emanating from him. The atmosphere is of a supernatural hope, invading an occupied city's gray routine, creating a retention tension based on the mystery of divine power transfer through human dust. The practical application for the viewer is the secret of impact. If you want your life to have eternal weight, stop trying to shine and start walking so close to Jesus that his light projects his shadow through you. Something deep crumbled in the sovereignty of illness over those people, and the victim of circumstances pattern was broken by the touch of a fisherman who learned to fish for men in the abyss. Tension remains in the crowd's movement. Everyone wants a piece of Peter, but Peter only has eyes for the master who lifted him from the Galilee ground. The mystery now is how a man's ego can remain small while his influence becomes gigantic. The viewer realizes Peter is no longer competing with the other apostles. He is too busy emptying the city's infirmities to remember who he used to be. The scene shifts to vibrant cosmopolitan Antioch. It's where the smell of foreign spices and the sound of diverse languages create an atmosphere of freedom Peter still struggles to fully digest. The realism here is of subtle social tension. You observe Peter sitting at the table with Gentiles, eating the bread of communion, until the sound of sandals arriving from Jerusalem makes his heart falter for a brief second. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals that the false self can have relapses even after great victories. Peter, the church leader, goes back to acting like the disciple in the courtyard, withdrawing from Gentiles to avoid judgment by his Jewish brothers. The central thesis is that sanctification is a layered process, where God needs to strip away not just obvious sin, but the subtle idolatry of approval from our own religious peers. The atmosphere is of public embarrassment, where the gritty realism focuses on the detail of Paul's gaze, piercing the room like a lightning bolt of truth, exposing the hypocrisy of one set free by grace, but hiding again in the law out of fear. You feel the table's uncomfortable silence, the smell of wine seeming to have lost its flavor, validating the pain of leadership failing to be consistent. This macro and micro connection shows how the future of the gospel's universality depended on Peter's willingness to accept public correction from a younger apostle. The practical application for the viewer is the solemn warning: no one is so mature they cannot fall again into the trap of trying to please men over God. Something deep crumbled in the image of infallible perfection some tried to project onto Peter. Tension lies in the giant's reaction. Will he rise in fury or bow in humility? The untouchable leader pattern is destroyed to make way for the teachable leader. The mystery of grace in Antioch is that Peter's failure served to establish the equality of all peoples before the cross. The viewer realizes Peter is human to the end, and his greatness is not in never failing, but in his incredible capacity to be corrected without losing his mission. Peter's agony here is the weight of being confronted by his own shadow of cowardice. Proven the rooster can still crow if the ego tries to sit on the throne again. You observe Peter sitting by the light of a small clay lamp in a simple house, years after the events of Antioch. Realism here is of a dignified and deep aging. The sound of the quill scratching the papyrus, the smell of fresh ink mixed with the aroma of burning olive oil, and the detail of his knuckles, now swollen and slow, yet writing with an authority the young Peter never possessed. This Autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the integration phase. Peter is no longer the man of impulses, but the elder who integrated his falls into his theology. The central thesis is that suffering, when processed by grace, transforms an explosive temperament into unshakable patience. You feel the papyrus texture under Peter's fingers and realize every word about suffering as a Christian was baptized in the blood of his own experience of humiliation and glory. The atmosphere is of a serenity charged with eternal weight, where the gritty realism focuses on the detail of his eyes, now possessing an oceanic depth, reflecting the peace of one who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. This macro and micro connection shows how Peter's letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, became the support system for a church about to enter the furnace of Roman persecution. The practical application for the viewer is the understanding that maturity is not the absence of scars, but the ability to use them to guide others through the darkness. Something deep crumbled in his need for human urgency, giving way to absolute trust in the sovereignty of God governing time and pain. Tension lies in the beauty of the words he chooses to describe the living hope. He writes about living stones because he himself was a stone that almost crumbled, yet was cemented by Jesus' gaze in the courtyard. The instinctive reaction pattern was replaced by the spiritual response. The mystery of Peter's longevity is revealed. He outlived himself so he could help the church outlive the world. The viewer realizes Peter's ego did not just die. It was replaced by an architecture of love sustaining millions to this day. Peter stopped being the man who acted on impulse to become the elder who acted by the Spirit. This metamorphosis is available to you today. If this autopsy of Peter's soul is bringing clarity to your life, subscribe now to the A Biblia Encina channel. Don't let this message end here. Share this video with someone who needs to know that God reconstructs what the world has shattered. You feel the change in the air as you follow Peter's steps into Rome, the epicenter of human power and cruelty. Realism here is oppressive and grand. The smell of arena blood mixed with the expensive perfume of senators, the constant sound of Roman soldiers' sandals against the Appian Way stones, and the cold lighting of marble columns seeming to crush the gospel's simplicity. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the final clash of kingdoms. The man who once denied Jesus before a servant girl now enters the world's capital to face the system that crucified his Lord. The central thesis is that Peter's agony reached its stage of total purification, where death is no longer a threat, but the final seal of his faithfulness. Gritty realism focuses on the detail of the chains now binding his wrists in the Mamertine prison, a damp, dark, foul basement where the smell of urine and the subsoil cold validate the pain of a destiny walking toward the end. This macro and micro connection shows how the redemption story narrows to the final testimony of a single man, whose words whispered in Rome's shadows will echo louder than Nero's edicts. The atmosphere is of sacred claustrophobia, where the practical application for the viewer is the perception that true victory is not in avoiding prison, but in remaining free inside while the body is chained. Something deep crumbled in the illusion that the empire could silence truth by imprisoning its spokesperson. Retention tension reaches a boiling point as Peter's days in prison draw to a close. He is no longer concerned with his own survival, but with preserving the faith of the brothers he shepherds from the cell's depths. And the life preservation pattern was swapped for life sacrifice. The mystery now dominating Rome's shadows is how such a broken man can possess a peace that terrifies his own jailers. You feel that Peter's agony is about to turn into his greatest trophy. You witness the moment Peter is led to Nero's circus for his final act. Realism here is brutal and unforgettable. The Roman sun's heat, the sound of the bloodthirsty crowd's shouts, and the sight of the rough wooden cross being prepared on the ground. This autopsy's Christian psychology peaks in Peter's request to be crucified upside down. This is not an act of religious exhibitionism, but the last breath of an ego refusing to be compared to its master. The central thesis is that Peter's humiliation was so complete and his healing so deep, that he feels unworthy to die the same way as Jesus. You observe the detail of nails tearing through calloused skin, the smell of iron and sweat, and the agonizing effort of a lung trying to breathe in a position defying gravity and human dignity. This macro and micro connection reveals the final collapse of any remnant of Peter's false self. In the cross's inversion, he finds his correct position before the universe, small, dependent, and totally surrendered. Gritty realism focuses on his gaze, now focusing on the earth, the dust from whence he came and to which he will return, while his soul flies toward the gaze that found him on the Galilee beach. The atmosphere is of a bloody and paradoxical glory, where the practical application for the viewer is the lesson that our life's end is not about how we are seen by men, but about how we finish before God. Something deep crumbled in Rome's arrogance upon seeing a man die with such serenity amidst such absurd torture. Retention tension dissolves in Peter's last breath, a breath carrying Jesus' name for the final time in the physical world. The fleeing traitor pattern was replaced by the remaining martyr. Peter's life mystery is solved in his death. He needed to be shattered so his testimony would be eternal. The viewer realizes the true church was built on this surrender, a rock the gates of hell could not prevail against because it learned to die upside down so the kingdom could stay upright. You walk through the ruins of Nero's circus, where the smell of burning and the iron scent of dried blood still impregnate the soil. Realism here is of a deafening void. The crowd dispersed, but the silence left behind is heavier than any shout. This autopsy's Christian psychology reveals the impact vacuum phenomenon. Peter's death was not the end of a man, but the release of a message that now has no body to imprison. The central thesis is that a life's true influence is measured by what it leaves in others' hearts when the ego finally exits the stage. You observe the detail of a lost sandal in the arena and a small piece of dirtied linen, symbols of the human fragility used to carry eternal glory. The atmosphere is of sacred melancholy, where the practical application for the viewer is the confrontation with your own spiritual heritage. What will remain of you when your hands can no longer hold anything? This macro and micro connection shows how the martyrdom of a single Galilean fisherman began to crack the foundations of the earth's greatest empire. Gritty realism focuses on the wind-blown dust over where the cross stood, erasing the physical trail, yet unable to touch the spiritual mark left in history's fabric. Retention tension lies in the question, how can a man who died upside down have set the world upright? Something deep crumbled in the Roman executioner's perception of power upon realizing they didn't kill a rebel, but sowed an apostle. The physical defeat pattern was transmuted into spiritual victory. The mystery of Peter's legacy is that he became the rock not because he was unbreakable, but because he allowed God to use every one of his cracks to let the light through. The viewer feels that Peter's agony was, in fact, his greatest healing. You pause before history's mirror and face Peter's image, but now, what you see is your own reflection. Realism here is of a cutting clarity, the smell of your own religiosity's incense and the cold sweat of your own secret denials. This final Autopsy's Christian psychology reveals this video's absolute thesis. God did not crush Peter's ego out of cruelty, but out of surgical necessity. An inflated ego is a barrier to grace. A rigid self-sufficiency is an impediment to anointing. You feel the weight of the truth that Peter could only build the church because he himself was demolished first. The atmosphere is of a therapeutic revelation, where Peter's pain becomes the medicine for your own frustration with your failures. Gritty realism focuses on your own heart beating, your skin's texture aging, and your promise's fragility. This macro and micro connection unites Caiaphas' courtyard to your bedroom, your desk, and your moments of isolation. Practical application is an invitation to rest. If God's plan for humanity depended on a man who failed miserably under pressure, then there is hope for your rubble. Something deep crumbled in your need to appear perfect before a God who already saw you at your worst and still prepared a breakfast on the beach for you. Retention tension now turns to the future. What does God want to build over your failures? The religious perfectionism pattern is replaced by redeemed vulnerability. The final mystery is that agony is not a punishment, but the process of removing what is not eternal in us. The viewer realizes Peter's suffering was the price of his freedom, and that your own suffering can be the portal to an authority you never imagined possessing. You return mentally to the Galilee shores, where the smell of fresh water and the rhythmic sound of waves bring closure to this immersive journey. Realism here is of a post-storm peace. Today's sunlight shines over the same waters where Peter dove, reminding us that mercy is new every morning. Christian psychology ends this autopsy with the seal of hope. Jesus' gaze that crossed the courtyard is still upon you, not to accuse you for the rooster that crowed in your life, but to ask you for the third time, do you love me? The final thesis is that your usefulness to the kingdom begins the moment you admit your love is imperfect, but his forgiveness is absolute. The atmosphere is one of deep welcome, where the narrator's voice becomes a whisper in the viewer's soul. This macro and micro connection reveals that Peter's story is the story of each of us who has ever felt like a traitor to our own destiny. Gritty realism focuses on the detail of an outstretched hand, your hand, which can now open to receive grace instead of trying to conquer glory. Practical application is a silent prayer of surrender, where the ego finally rests and the soul begins to breathe. Something deep crumbled in the wall of guilt separating you from the master. The fear of failure pattern was overcome by the courage to start over. The mystery ending this video is the miracle of a life that, even shattered, becomes a cathedral of faith. You are no longer the same after witnessing Peter's agony, because now you know that God doesn't use perfect people. He uses people who learn to weep bitterly and to love intensely. The fire on the beach is still lit, and there is a place for you,